It's God's big tick to Jesus. The resurrection and ascension vindicate his earthly life, confirm his divinity, and testify to the truth of his teaching. But in modernity, such tales are an embarrassment. The person and teachings of Jesus are inspiring, we are told. But if you don't want to lose people, it's best to downplay the hard-to-believe bits, like the virgin birth and life after death, and the hard-to-live bits, like moral absolutes, virtues, and holiness. As for tales of a dead man returning, breaking out of his tomb, appearing to his mates, and then flying through the air, what self-respecting child of the scientific age could believe this? Yet the Gospels present Jesus' death and resurrection as the most crucial thing about him. It's better attested than almost any other event of ancient times. There is, for instance, far more evidence of this than there is of the deaths of Julius Caesar or Augustus. After his passion, our first reading records, Jesus showed himself alive to the apostles by many demonstrations. For 40 days, he continued to appear to them. What were these convincing proofs of Jesus' resurrection? First, though tight shut with a huge rock and under guard of Roman soldiers, the tomb was found unoccupied on the third day. Angels, women, apostles, soldiers, Jewish leaders, and the apostolic generation all testified to the empty tomb. Thereafter, Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene, Peter, Thomas, John, James, and Paul, to the holy women, the Emmaus 2, the 7 who went fishing, the 11, and a much bigger crowd as well. There's no reason to think that these were all fantasists or spin doctors. And if we rely upon the Gospels for so much else, why regard them as suddenly unreliable come the last chapter? No doubt the stories were intended to inform and persuade. But were the writers concocting a fiction? They'd surely have claimed more respectable witnesses than grieving women and cowardly fishermen. You'd expect visions of a dazzling white Jesus exalted on the clouds, rather than tattooed with the marks of the Passion, mundanely eating fish with his friends. That these very ordinary witnesses, events, and doubts were presented so candidly suggests the New Testament accounts tried to tell it as it was. But wasn't it all just wishful thinking? Well, the apostles very clearly did not wish for it. Though there were intimations of resurrection in the Old Testament, And though Jesus had predicted this for himself before he died, the disciples had no idea what it meant. So when reports of sightings started to filter in, they were incredulous. And so Jesus came close, again and again. He was seen, heard, touched. He ate with them. One by one, they were convinced by the demonstrations he gave. Thirdly, the disciples changed radically from cowering wrecks to courageous evangelists. Short of something extraordinary, this is hard to explain. Were it mass hallucination, the bubble would eventually have burst. Were the bodies stolen by Jews or Romans, it would surely have been produced to discredit the new religion. For the disciples themselves to have stolen the body would have required them to circumvent the soldiers, roll away the stone, snatch the body away unnoticed, and evade the authorities' search for it. Even if they could manage all this, such deception would render inexplicable their change of heart and behaviour, their willingness to suffer and even to die for their new mission. How could the apostles have come to believe that the Master had conquered death if they still had his corpse hidden away somewhere? Fourthly, the disciples recognised that Christ's credibility and theirs stands or falls on whether he really rose from the dead. They could easily have put aside this claim as one unlikely to convince the sophisticated and likely to get them into trouble. Yet they testified to the resurrection above all. They had come to believe it was the fulfillment of messianic prophecy and the foundational fact of the new gospel. It drove all that followed. Fifth, and finally, of Jesus' many demonstrations or convincing proofs of his resurrection, the truth of the Christian faith, the beauty of the church, and the goodness of her members, such as they are all predicated on the resurrection. It is the sine qua non of Christianity and was the basis of its phenomenal growth. Each one must judge for themselves whether this was lie, delusion, or truth. And evidence alone will not bring people to faith. At best, it prepares people for faith or confirms them in it. But every institution and system known to history built upon a monstrous lie has ultimately crumbled. The longest standing one, the Catholic Church, was built upon the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Having abandoned Christianity in his teens, the English academic and writer C.S. Lewis was a skeptic through his 20s. declaring belief in miracles and the resurrection a kind of nonsense. Yet he kept reading, and as he later admitted, that's a dangerous thing for someone who wants to remain an atheist. The unscrupulous God laid traps for him, he said, in books like the Bible, in indubitable facts, in surprises galore. Under the influence of his devout Catholic friend, J.R.R. Tolkien, and having wrestled with the evidence for many years, Lewis had a crisis of unfaith in his 30s and found himself dragged back to Christianity, kicking, struggling, resentful, he said. The God he so earnestly desired not to meet became irresistible, and his resurrection undeniable. Lewis's resulting works, The Problem of Pain, The Screwtape Letters, and Mere Christianity, became classics of Christian apologetics. What persuaded Lewis and others were the many demonstrations that Jesus offered of his resurrection in the body, not merely in myth or memory. But all records agree that these Easter appearances came to an abrupt end after 40 days. To say Christ ascended into heaven and is now seated at the right hand of the Father is to say that his glorification as Son of God and Saviour King has been completed. He is now present to us in a different way, through word and sacrament, church and saints, above all through the Eucharist in our bodies and the Spirit in our hearts. And he glorifies his Father in heaven, there exercising the priestly office of intercession for us. But in returning to the Father, did Jesus at last cast off the human nature to which his divine nature had been united since the Annunciation? To put it another way, does the Ascension represent the completion of the Incarnation and Resurrection, or the undoing, a decarnation and unresurrection? Well, all accounts suggest Jesus' departure was no disappearing act, like someone with a magic ring in a Lewis or Tolkien novel, and no fading away like a ghost in a ghost story. He was witnessed ascending heavenward, returning to the Father in his spiritual and material reality. Rather than leaving his body behind, he took our human nature up into the very court of God. In making us living bodily beings, God did not put us in a cage from which we might hope one day to escape. No, he made us more than ghosts, more even than angels. He gave us sight and voice, presence and intimacy. Only beings like us can touch the wounds of Christ. And so for us to survive without our bodies would be an impoverishment, even vandalism, and God is no vandal. The life of heaven will be all we properly are now and more, not less. So Jesus was raised to a new and glorious life, and we too will be raised in our totality from grave to glory. The resurrection and ascension, then, are God's big tick to Jesus. But they are also his big tick to every human being, from the tiniest to the oldest, as destined for heaven, and so always worthy of awe, respect, and care. On earth with the Spirit, then to heaven with Christ.